Hello and welcome back to Ion Radio and another episode of Data Link, where I bring a whole bunch of different people, mostly developers, to you guys at home. Joining me today, I have two very special guests. Both of them are designers on Star Trek Into the Unknown, and you may recognize them from a few other games that are also on the channel. Today with me, I have Max Brooke and Michael Gernes. Guys, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, thank you for having us on.
Nice to join you.
So today we're going to talk about a number of different things. The chief one being Star Trek Into the Unknown, with both wow, that's not going to get edited out. We're going to keep that one in. But Star Trek Into the Unknown, where you guys both have a big part in the game's design and what we're going to be seeing in the not too distant future, if all the information I have is correct. Star Trek Into the Unknown is right around the corner. We've seen some uh, fun demos at Gen Con. I think they were at Adepticon as well. And I got to speak to John Schaefer at Gen Con, so he gave me a little bit more information there too. Another name that a bunch of people probably know. But I do have my hands on the preview kit, had an opportunity to play through both episodes that are currently out. So if you folks at home are interested, get your hands on a copy. I think this is the August version of GTM, where you can get the second mission that will work with the preview kit. There's my one pitch that I'm giving. I'm done. But let's talk to you guys. You guys are the designers. I'll let either one of you guys go ahead and start. But Max or Michael, what kind of got you into the role of becoming a developer? Let's go back to the beginning and then work our way into Star Trek.
Yeah, so I sort of blame my parents for a variety of reasons, but they exposed me to all sorts of, fun, interesting stuff as a kid. One of the first shows I remember watching through with my dad was, Star Trek Voyager. We watched that start to finish. Which, hopefully I don't get booed off for that. I still have a soft spot for Voyager. But yeah, and then I with that and my mom reading me Redwall and Lord of the Rings, all that, I went on to study medieval literature. Finding no direct application for that, I started throwing my resume at all kinds of jobs, and the one that first panned out was at a at the time fairly small game studio. It was big for a board game studio at the time, though. Fantasy Flight Games, and that happened to work out. I got a job as an RPG producer, so I was working on the Warhammer 40K roleplay, which was great because I was getting to use another thing I thought I'd never get to use, which was the countless hours in college I spent playing Warhammer 40K and Dark Heresy and such. So I worked on Rogue Trader for a while. Then I moved on to the Star Wars RPG lines. And then I got the chance to jump into the world of minis, which I'd played a lot of, and I knew the minis team folks pretty well, Frank and Alex. But I'd had a chance to actually work with some minis stuff with Michael on Dust Warfare. I didn't do a lot of direct stuff with that, but I did a lot of testing on that, which I really enjoyed. The RPG team, they knew we were a bunch of minis nerds, so I remember there was that all hands on deck where we got pulled in for a bunch of early Dust Warfare stuff with you and Mac. That was a lot of fun. And yeah, and then so from there it's been minis, and then I went freelance a couple years ago, and I've been doing my thing since. I did Stone Saga, a game that I'm just wrapping up now, that was on Kickstarter a while ago, and we will be delivering on the new schedule, which I actually feel really good about. And yeah, I've been in the rule book all day today, so if at any point my eyes glaze over, that's why. But it's coming along really well. Adam Baker did a great job writing it, and we've had a really good tech editor. So yeah, and then obviously Star Trek Into the Unknown is the other thing that's been keeping me pretty busy. And we'll get more into that today.
I have to admit, because you brought it up, there are exactly 6 episodes of Star Trek that I have never seen, and all of them are in the last season of Voyager, and I'm slowly working my way through those. Actually, I'm on like that last 6 now. I saw the final episode. It's the 6 before it. So I'm actually excited and kind of a little sad because when this is done, I will have seen every episode of Star Trek ever. But it's just funny that you mentioned that because I will say Voyager's a great show.
But Voyager has a really high quality variance. It has some great episodes. It has some not great episodes. I yeah, I watched it as a kid, so I have sort of a soft spot for it. But my partner Debbie watched it as an adult, and I rewatched part of it with her, and there were definitely episodes where, having seen all of TNG now, I was like, "Oh, that was just kind of a worse version of that TNG episode." But there are other episodes that hold up great, so it's a mixed bag. But I still like Voyager on balance, and I love all the Prodigy callbacks to Voyager and the way that tied up a lot of those plot threads. Those have been a lot of fun.
They're
I think
both
that's a show that's time has kind of caught up with it. You know, the people who grew up with that show are now people making media and games about Star Trek. So it's kind of nice to see. I was not the biggest Voyager fan when it was on, but I there's plenty of Voyager episodes I think are solid.
Mhm. There are quite a few that I have thoroughly enjoyed throughout the 7 year run. But I'll also sit there and say you could probably point at any series of Star Trek and find a couple episodes that you go, I don't need to ever watch that one again.
I I,
What? I don't know
I
what
have
you
a
mean.
I have a
Every Next Generation episode is gold, Ken.
I have a brief thing about this. I actually think I think I think Lower Decks has no whiffs. I think they're all pretty good. There are definitely, like, there's variants, but I think the quality spread is pretty tight. And I actually would say that, except for the episode BEM, Star Trek the Animated Series is very consistent on quality and very good, as long as you're bought in on the animation, which, as someone who kind of enjoys vintage animation, I think is really interesting and fun. But the scripts for those episodes are really good.
If I remember correctly, I think a certain segment of those scripts were actually supposed to be part of Star Trek Phase 2, and then wound up making themselves, I think that was mid 70s, 72, 73, maybe 74, that they came out in the production form with all the original cast coming back and James Doohan doing a lot of extra voices for that. Um, okay, I will agree. Bem was one of the weird ones of the 22 episodes there were in the animated series there. And okay, I will give you there. I have not hit a bad Lower Decks episode. There's one season left to go, but they're doing remarkably well. And actually, Strange New Worlds has been hitting it on pretty much all cylinders. But it's still new. You know, there's always time. What about
Yeah.
you, Michael? Your path into becoming a developer?
Well, a lot like Max, I grew up a child obsessed with science fiction and fantasy. Uh, I I was kind of a daydreamy kind of kid, and I really liked games. Really kind of inspired me because it was a way to interact with all those things. You know, like other places and times, take on different roles. Uh, I played all kinds of games as a kid and young adult. Like I dabbled with everything. But you know, like minis kind of always had a special place, or like minis-esque games. I played a lot of the usual suspects, like a lot of like classic BattleTech and Warhammer, other Games Workshop games. But I also always was into role playing and also into board games. Uh, I just knew I loved games, and you know, when I got into college, uh, I kind of knew I wanted to do something creative, and games kind of started to seem like a possible thing to do. Like a, you know, I knew there were different studios in the Midwest and things like that. Uh, and so I kind of just always kind of kept an eye on that. And I worked in the insurance industry for like years after college. And then I found my way in as a producer at Fantasy Flight. And I worked on a variety of different projects, but I got hired to be a producer of Minis Games. Um, and I worked on a couple different projects early, like Max mentioned, Dust Warfare. I was like kind of assisting on that game. And then I'd say like, the Armada was kind of like a real, career changer for me, producing that game. And yeah, like that's kind of led to like everything else. I've done a little bit of every minis game that we did in that period. And then I've been freelance myself since 2020. Max and I have worked on a couple different things together. I've also worked with Chip Theory Games on their Elder Scrolls
Mhm.
Betrayal of the Second Era game that's coming out pretty soon. So yeah, I've just kind of I kind of decided this is a good creative outlet for me, and I've kind of stuck around in the industry.
Well, that's cool. Now, Max mentioned that he kind of started with Voyager. What was your kind of introduction to Star Trek?
It was original series that was in syndication all the time when I was a kid. I watched a lot of that. I think Star Trek 3 is one of the first movies I remember going to see in a theater. Um, yeah, I mean that's kind of an odd one, right?
No, I'm
But
I'm
like
laughing because my introduction to Star
yeah,
Trek was Star Trek 3 in the summer of 1984.
okay, yeah,
Uh, because we've discussed you and I are about the same age,
yep,
but at the
yep,
time I was a big Star Wars fan. You go and you go to the movie theater, you see a Star Wars movie.
yeah.
And then my uncle took me to see Star Trek. I'm like, what is this? And then I'm like, this is good. And yeah, so that's why I'm laughing. So apologies.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, that's funny. It's funny how that's yeah. Anyway, I'm just old enough to have seen Return of the Jedi in the movie theater. Uh, Speaking of the other franchise, um, but it was really I would say the show that really took over for me was Next Generation because that just kind of hit right in my formative years.
No, I get you. But then that was it was an interesting experiment because you're so used to Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, and can you ever really replicate that type of a show? And boy, did the Next Generation crew, they really were able to stand on their own, and that created this great period of Star Trek in the mid 80s that went all the way into the early 2000s,
Yeah,
and kind of formed this great basis for this game that we're about to start talking about.
I was just gonna say the
Uh,
same thing.
it's amazing how you guys are making my segues so easy. Can you come onto the channel more often for stuff like that? So how did you guys get involved with actually designing Star Trek Into the Unknown?
Yeah, so Alex Davey was working at WizKids at the time with Brian Kinsella, who's also working there, and the two of them I think originally approached me, but pretty quickly I said, I need Mike to do this, and then we jumped on from there. So they had like a high level pitch of like Star Trek game. They had a few things they knew they really wanted from it. They knew they wanted it to be, a pretty detailed game, a pretty narratively oriented game. Attack Wing was much more of a sort of, like it has a bit of that X-Wing, or, arcadiness. I mean, it's on the flight path engine. It plays very similarly, which is great for games that like get to the table quickly, play quickly, but it doesn't necessarily scratch all the thematic itches you might want. I mean, I remember with X-Wing, people would always say, "Oh, I really want the ability to like adjust power like I could in X-Wing versus TIE Fighter."
Uh,
Or, I wasn't as up on what the attackman community was talking about, but I'm sure they had their own similar considerations. And that's just, that game is sort of simpler, more abstract, more focused on that. And, one of the things I remember Brian Kinsella said to us was like, oh, I want this to be like very narratively hooked in, very thematic, and I want there to be saucer separation on the Enterprise.
so saucer separation was one of like the initial pitches, has to be in the game then.
Yeah. Yeah, that was
I mean,
before we even knew if it was technically possible. He was just like, it's in the game, and we were like, all right, well, we'll figure out the mechanics if you can figure out the sculpt.
yeah,
That's
those
kind
were
of neat.
like those were the words I wanted to hear too. So like I think it's that was something I was excited to do.
Oh
What's
yeah.
what's interesting is saucer separation, I think, happened a grand total of like 5 times throughout the series. And if I remember correctly, I think when they were filming it, they said it like was $1 million shot. So every time they did it, it was just expensive. So that's why it didn't happen very often. I mean, today you could do it with CGI all you want, but back in the days of models and 7 passes to make it look as good as it did, um, yeah, so that's really cool that it, like Inception uh sausage separation was there. So that's kind of neat. So you kind of touched on some of the things. Star Trek Into the Unknown is, and I've played the preview kit and I had an opportunity to go through the 2 games. And I might touch on some of my feelings on how I feel it's kind of presented. All positive, by the way. But within the confines of the games, there's a lot of elements that went into it. And Max, you started talking about changing your shields like in X-Wing versus TIE Fighter, and you could do your forward and double the front and everything else. Within the context of Star Trek Into the Unknown, you've got that alert wheel and you've got different status levels. And, so you can go from green to yellow to red alert. And within that, it's like recharging your power and you have better sensors or better weapons and better shields. Talk to me a little bit about kind of what either inspired or helped you create this concept, because it's a really interesting, streamlined way of dealing with all the systems aboard a starship.
I'm gonna kick this one over to Mike because this was kind of his baby.
Okay.
It really came from a mix of the show and like Star Trek media. Like alerts are such a thing. Um, and I remember watching. I usually I rewatch Star Trek a lot anyway, even without this project. But when we started working on this, I remember rewatching some episodes and hearing, I think it was like Chief O'Brien mentioned, talking about another ship's alert state. And I thought about like, okay, so this isn't just like this is maybe a general concept within Star Trek. Um, and Star Trek is just, they talk so much about energy management as like a thing in Star Trek stories. And I kind of thought about like the different trade-offs, the obvious trade-offs between the different alert states. Um, and other Star Trek games I had played had also played on the idea of energy management, and I thought it just seemed really like a thing we'd want to do. Um, and around that time, I had also had the chance to work as an editor on the game Star D&D Onslaught. And so I was already doing a little work for WizKids, and WizKids, you know, does a lot with dial technology, and dials are just kind of a part of the in-house style. And that seemed like, those things seemed like a great way to kind of like implement that kind of energy management theme, but like right there in front of you without having, in the old days it would have been like pen and paper, right? And this is a way to do it in a more like contemporary method.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking back immediately to games from late 70s and early 80s, things like the Star Trek Combat Simulator from FASA, whereas here's your list of energy points you're giving to engines and shields and everything else, or the pre-turn setup of 32 items for Starfleet battles. And it actually took longer to allocate your power than it did to play through the preceding turn. So having gone through, I remember when Into the Unknown first got announced that it was going to be a detailed and to scale miniature game. And I was talking with John and I said, I wonder if they're going to do some kind of energy allocation thing because that will sell me on the game. As soon as I saw the alert status wheel just in some of the pictures, predating me getting my hands on my grubby little hands onto the preview kit, I'm like, okay, I'm all in on this game and I don't know anything about it yet. So that's me. This is one of the things that having played through a couple episodes is one of the elements that really attracts me. And as a gamer I'm getting to that grognard point now because I'm almost at that age. Really appeals to me. A lot of I've been enjoying you know playing with that and conceptually the mathematics that runs through my head with that.
It's interesting you mentioned that sort of grognard appeal because I think one of the hallmarks of this game is we're trying to walk a tightrope, and I think we've done it pretty successfully of delivering novel implementations of things that make grognards say, "Oh, this is exactly what I wanted," because a lot of that was in Brian and Alex's original conception of like fiddly detail but delivered with a more elegant maybe component solution than might have been done previously.
I think you guys hit the mark pretty well. At least that's my perspective. When the game's released, a lot of people, I'm sure, will voice their opinions.
Oh
Uh,
yes.
but but I'm enjoying it. And with a couple different friends that I've already played the game with, that are younger than me and one older, all kind of earn agreement. That's the one thing that, like, I don't have to fill out 40 boxes anymore. This is great. Um, Go figure.
Well, I'm of a similar vintage, and I have to say, like I'm probably one of my friends in my gaming group referred to me as the old head recently. Like, so I definitely I'm kind of a grognard by nature anyway. I liked all those games. Being in the industry for this, for the last decade or so, has kind of give me it injected a lot of that desire to like make things more convenient today. But I also got to, I'm lucky enough to work with Max. Max is really good at like, being positive about wanting to hit those themes. And then he's really good at telling me, give me a chance to refine those things or saying, well, this could be a little smoother if we did this. So he was very supportive of the alert wheel, but definitely like we refined that together.
Yeah, well, and again, as soon as we put that prototype on the table, I was like, okay, we're going the right direction with this thing. Like specifics are going to change and evolve, but this merging of power allocation and stance in a thematic way really works. The other thing I remember you talking about with the genesis of the alert wheel was how it not only has these power allocation implications, but can sort of also have diplomatic implications, which is something we very much wanted to play out in the game and plays out through the directive system where if you see your opponent shooting up to red alert, that's where all the guns are. You're going to start looking pretty askance at like getting within weapons range of their ships if their shields are up and their guns are primed. Um, and so, that sort of having that stance of like that gives away some information about your intentions, but then maybe you're bluffing, maybe you don't really want to get into a firefight, but you jump to an aggressive posture to try to scare them off, pull a little bit of a Jellicoe move. There's a lot of interesting dynamics there.
I hadn't thought about that actually, about intentionally raising your alert status to so now you're playing a game within the game. I like it. I'm gonna try that the next time I get the game to the table, which has to be before I release this video, or my plans will be not. Actually, one thing that you touched on specifically with, yeah, if you're up at red alert, you have all the power available to guns. There are times where if you are on that first green status, you've got no power to weapons, which means you cannot allocate any of your reserve power either. You're not shooting, which was really kind of a neat concept. I ran across that in one of my test games, and I was like, that's not good.
Yeah,
I
you
just
want to you want to be planning a turn or two out. It's not,
Yeah.
it's not hard locked. You can get there, but it's one of those things where we wanted to make sure that you could get between alert statuses effectively enough to sort of reposition during the game, and also so that new players weren't completely hosed if they didn't plan it out right. And we looked a lot to the tempo of the Armada dials and the way it's like, I remember the first game of Armada I played, I think it was either with you or with Sam Gregor Stewart. I don't remember, Mike, but I remember playing this game and just getting my butt kicked because I messed up all my dials. But it wasn't like I couldn't play the game. I could. I just didn't get the benefits I needed when I needed them. And that tempo was something we were trying to not, replicate because it's a very different game, but get that same feel of like, okay, planning out your choices is important, but the cost for messing them up isn't you're hosed. It's you have a bit of a disadvantage. Maybe you're at an energy disadvantage, or you're at an action disadvantage, or a little bit of both.
Yeah. We wanted planning in this game to feel like Star Trek planning, and alerts. It's a canon level expression of the idea of stances.
No, that's kind of cool. I love it. It fits with that concept of Star Trek, right? And it's just neat. Uh, Again, getting into all the various different things that you can do in terms of sensors or shields or whatnot. And then it also kind of adds into the different aspects of the game. What is your mission objective? So just even in the two that we have, there might be a benefit to destroying the other ship. Uh, but if you do it in kind of an odd way, you might actually not score enough victory points to still win the mission. So there's a lot of things that you're thinking about uh, to really kind of overcome the different challenges. Actually, that's one part of the design of the game that I really enjoy. I was recently reading a book on the making of Star Trek, and they talked about how this goes to the original series, where each episode kind of focused on usually Captain Kirk or some crew member overcoming some kind of challenge and the step that they did to overcome that challenge or see someone else grow. And it wasn't always a space combat or, Kirk gets his shirt cut up at the end of it, or Spock coming up with something intelligent. But there's a variety of different ways to resolve the mission. And even in the two that are currently available, you see two completely different ways or mechanisms with which to accomplish those missions. And then there's always that combat option also. And we haven't even gotten to the full reveal of everything in the core set yet. So what can you guys tell me a little bit more on that concept with kind of the missions and the ability to win a game?
I think Max. This is something Max put a lot of thought into, and we talked about together. But I think he should talk about this one.
Absolutely. So the directives are really sort of key to this. There's the missions and the directives, and you kind of look at those things in concert. So, the missions, you've seen, you got to show off the combat directive, and then the GTM mission shows off the diplomacy directive,
Mhm.
right? And there's a third directive, an exploration directive. And the directives were something we tinkered a lot with. We knew it was really important for faction identity that each faction really feel like it has its own, like reasons for doing things and its own ethos and its own beliefs. Because that's such an important point in, Star Trek. And it's an especially important part of the Dominion War because from a functional standpoint, the Dominion and the Federation sort of look similar if you really look at a high level and you don't you obscure the details, but the details are really where the important differences come out. That the Dominion, yes, they're a multicultural sort of like agglomeration, but they have a much more like top down structure. They have much less egalitarian ideals. They're much more willing to be ruthless when it benefits them. And so, we wanted that to really come out in that like these two powers are very similar in some ways, very different in others, and the differences are nuanced. And we wanted to really speak to that with the directive system. Um, so each faction has a different set of these directives, which help you score victory points during the game, in addition to the mission. Um, and that is going to sort of, guide how you play the game. And, one of the key differences you can see on the combat directive is the Federation has no way um, it, to directly flip their combat directive. Now, if the other side starts heating things up and escalating, they can flip in response, but they have to wait until the other side decides to sort of, raise the tensions. Um, But the Dominion, if they get far enough behind, they can just go hot on weapons
Mhm.
because they decide they don't want to play nice anymore, and they're not really bound by an ethical obligation to play nice. They just do it because it's expedient. Um, the other really key thing here is the system of the influence track and the complication. And the complication goes back to something Mike said early on in a design meeting, which is in Star Trek, you win by understanding. And do you want to speak to that a bit, Mike?
Yeah, well, I can't take credit for that line. I got that from a Star Trek podcast I listened to, but the I thought it was so right. And obviously, we're making a minis game. It's got to be about conflict, but it was really important to us that you there were multiple ways to resolve the conflict, and even though we're like competing, and it's a win or lose game, it's not automatically a battle game every time. It can be some missions can actually be semi cooperative, even though we're trying to like defeat each other. And we sat down, we talked a lot about like wanting those kind of feelings out of Star Trek, wanting the fact that the Federation has like a real essential like science and exploration role to kind of matter. Because if you're not representing that, they could feel like, well, what do they have as a faction?
Hmm.
So I think a lot of things like the directives really came out of that. A lot of the structure of the game with the acts also came out of those discussions.
So we're talking about like the when you mentioned acts, we're talking
Yeah,
about that initial the what do they call it? The overture,
Overture.
yeah,
which is
yep,
kind of your first act, kind of gives you the situation, I think was the term used
yep,
in terms of what's going on in the map, the beginning part, and then you get that halfway through the episode commercial break where the complication shows up right at the end, and then it's how do we resolve it? Uh, Again, another interesting thing that I've seen playing through it, just because you're not really quite sure which way it can go, and it could very easily flip very late in the first half of the mission.
It was really important to us that the game system be able to replicate, we want it to feel, we want every mission to really feel like an episode of Star Trek. And one of the key things in that is a lot of the time it is unclear what direction things are going to go. I mean, a great example I love to go back to because it's not a Dominion War example, but it is a great example is the trouble with tribbles, where throughout that episode it's very unclear if this is going to turn into a shooting fight between the Federation and the Klingons. And like both sides escalate and push on each other. Their teams engage in a brawl. But then ultimately they sort of uncover that there's a bigger problem everyone has to deal with together, and then it becomes more of a political pushing match. Or for a Deep Space Nine episode, shoot, Mike, you'll have to remind me the title here. I can't remember it. The one where they have to team up against the renegade Jem'Hadar.
to the death.
To
To the
the
death.
death,
Yeah.
yes.
Mhm.
Yeah,
To the Death was another one we talked a lot about, and that was a big influence on the ideas we have of like, okay, like you might have a mission where like it turns out there is a much bigger existential threat of these renegade Jem'Hadar with Iconian technology that you have to deal with, and it is pressing to both of you that get dealt with.
yeah.
Is this like a preview tease of things to come with some of the away team component parts, maybe?
Yeah,
Uh,
I mean, yeah. There may well be a mission in the game that's a lot like the episode to the death and involves
Okay.
a lot of the way team stuff. So
Okay, that's neat. I was kind of curious about that because I think To the Death is one of the key episodes in the Deep Space Nine story, which if you're at home watching, really interested in this game, you should watch. There's about 20 or 30 key episodes in all of Deep Space Nine to get the full Dominion War story. Uh, that's one of them, and a really good one too, especially with how that starts and it ends in the middle with the complication of finding the Vorta and on the
mhm.
was it the disabled Jem'Hadar fighter I think that they found, but
yeah, yeah, I
but
think
anyways,
so.
following on the Iconians. technology that goes back to Next Gen season 2, I think, maybe even season
Yeah,
1.
it's two. Yeah,
I forget.
yeah.
Um, okay, that actually leads me into another interesting question since we started talking about officers. So like I said, you guys are doing great. It's almost as if you know what I want to talk about. Uh, but let's go ahead and talk about some of the officers. So in the GTM mission, Delicate Negotiations, uh, in the setup, it's talking about having available officers as if you're playing it as part of a campaign. What can you tell me about, because in the preview kit, you've got your 4 officers, that's it. What can you tell me about officers in terms of their use, what's in the core box, and kind of like how that works into a campaign?
Well, so you have access to a roster of officers from the outset of the campaign, and that's defined by the campaign, like the starting conditions. And you can add officers as you go through the campaign's missions, like as you progress. Um, and so that's who's available. And then in each mission, when you actually like build the task force of officers that are going to be essentially your bridge crew, uh, you have to draw them from the list of who's available. And as the campaign goes on, some officers might become incapacitated and be in hospital. Some might be lost during missions and are just not accessible until you either recover them or maybe you never recover them. And so that I think that's where that language about available officers comes from. Um, I think Max could probably elaborate a bit on list building, and like the nature of what a task force means in this game.
Yeah. So to assemble your task force, your first step, unlike a number of other space battle games I've worked on, your first step is not choosing your ships. Actually, it's choosing your officers. And in a campaign, you've got your roster. You might also get access in a campaign to transfer officers. In the campaign, those will be specified. There's a different way for determining them in a sort of a match play scenario. And they'll be thematically fitting to the mission. So, if you're, doing a mission that relates to, has a particular science objective, we might have, Jadzia added as a transfer officer, for instance, for that mission. In which case, even if she's not on your roster, you can add her. Um, and yeah, your roster expands with time. If you're just playing a match play mission, your roster is your collection, essentially. And you'll select officers of your faction. Selecting officers who have sway with other factions can give you access to transfer officers from those other factions, and can give you access to even ships from those other factions. So you can have your big moment where Worf calls in a bird of prey, if you bring enough officers with sway over the Klingon Empire, for instance. And that was our way of, we wanted to make sure that faction identity was strongly held and reinforced, and you weren't just mixing and matching everything. We know that that was sort of one of the more abstract considerations of Attack Wing that a lot of people felt could be a bit unthematic. And so we wanted to make sure, like if you're bringing in an officer from or a ship from another faction, you're doing it by, through the connections you have in your task force. And then once you have your task force, you get the mission out. You look at the mission, and then the mission will tell you what types of ships you have available to you. If it's a story mission, it might say exactly like, oh, you've got these specific ships. You have a Galaxy class with the Enterprise title on it. Or it might say you have one capital class ship, in which case you can take any capital class ship you have on your roster. Um, and again, for match play, the missions will provide you that. The incident mission cards used for that give you a list of those things, what you have for the mission. And so then you take a look at the mission, you say, okay, this looks like a sciencey mission. I'd really like a constellation for this mission, so I'm going to take a constellation. Or, like, oh, I have this officer who plays really well with this ship. So even though maybe it's a little less optimal for the mission, I really want to fly that together. So I take that because I think that the officer synergy is worth it or something. So there's a lot of choice there. And you have a lot of flexibility. For, tournament and event structure, there's still some TBDs on that. Most of the OP plans we've heard about are narratively focused and like the GTM mission may have a lot of tie-ins with your home campaigns. Um, that's something John's really excited about. Um, so there's a good chance that there'll be some connections there. But for people looking for, if they really want to run an event, that's something we want to provide guidance on, and not making sure you don't have to bring every ship in your collection is one thing we've been thinking about. Um, but we do like the idea that you still have some flexibility in your ships mission by mission. And so you can say like, okay, this mission seems well suited to this. I'm taking, you know, this ship because I like these features it has.
Will this be something where we've already talked about having an officer roster? There'll be a ship roster also for your task force.
Yes, for campaigns, there'll be a ship roster as well.
So when one gets destroyed, that's gone, then I take it.
Well,
Um, Go ahead, Michael.
oh, it's you can essentially rebuild ships, uh, and and they'll be in. You can repair them from like even the destroyed state. It costs extra, so it's like you know you're finding that other ship and renaming it Enterprise. Um, so you could rebuild those ships, but you know they can enter the next mission at a state where they're weaker than they normally would be. They'll have battle damage. That's kind of one of the ways we try to have the consequences of missions matter. So you might decide, okay, well, this ship is really banged up, so we're not going to use that for this mission. Instead, I'm going to use this ship that is maybe less powerful, but it's a constellation class, so I'm actually going to get some bonus points to use to buy, equipment maybe.
The,
Okay.
the other thing to consider there too for campaign games is there are a number of strategic acquisitions you can make with the sort of strategy points you'll get over the course of the campaign. Strategy points can be used to add rosters to your list. They can be used to add ships to your list. They can be used to add these strategic acquisitions to your list. And a lot of those strategic acquisitions can help you, rebuild from a bad position. You might be able to get one that is an improved space docks that improves your repair, and so you're going to be able to get more repair. In fact, even in your officers will have some impact on your ability to bounce back from crew loss and ship damage and such, because you'll generate a repair pool based on your highest skills in mechanics and biology. Um, and so having a really good doctor on your roster, even if you don't take them to missions, can be valuable simply because they will generate more, healing that you can use on your officers and on your ship's crew dials.
So that roster of officers you have in your task force are actually useful even outside of the missions, which is kind of cool. And these strategic what would you call them? The strategic
Acquisitions.
acquisitions. Thank you. Ferengies, yes, of course. Um, are these going to be things like, so one of the questions that I've been curious about, because, campaigns, one of the things is building up your task force. And during the course of the Dominion War in the Star Trek series, we saw that ships got shield upgrades and better weaponry and maybe better technology installed on their ships. Are these going to be those kind of items that you see that you can add into your fleets?
Equipment is a thing in the game. You, it's going to be, you'll add that to your ships on a mission by mission basis.
Okay.
Uh, but your crews, like your crew stats can also fluctuate in addition to your ship's hull. So, and you can inspire your crews. I think that's right there in the training mission. So like you'll see that fluctuate as well. We don't right now have like permanent upgrades that you would add to a ship during the campaign. It's like, okay, this ship now has better guns permanently. Uh, but when you enter a mission, you might decide to give it special equipment for that mission, which could include something like, our phasers, they're variable phasers now, so we're going to be better at penetrating shields, for example. I think that's sort of that's sort of how we came at this. Is we decided that in this game we wanted officers to be the first consideration, and like ships are important, um, but we're kind of, and actually like one of the episodes we thought about a lot with this is, I think it's I can't remember the name of it. There's an episode about the Klingon Civil War, and they decide to put together a blockade. Captain Picard is going to lead this blockade, and they have ships enough to go around, but not enough officers. I think that's Redemption Part Two.
Redemption Part Two. Data takes over
Yeah.
the USS Sutherland. Yes.
Right, right. And so that actually episode kind of informed a lot about how we thought about like officers and ships in this game, and that characters, it's kind of character centric that way. But ships definitely have like their own capabilities and their own uses. But we're not upgrading the ships as much as a focus, like permanently upgrading them, like that might happen in like a different system, a different game system.
But there are some new technologies you can research. That is something we tried to play with. Yes. We tried to make sure they're not a bookkeeping nightmare. We don't want to be telling you that you have a different value on your alert dial than it says or something like that. But like a simple example that's like a kind of an exciting, fun one is there's I know we have at least we have two different strategic acquisitions that occur in different places, where you get the ability to acquire some kind of technology from another faction. And so you add a mission equipment to your roster that you wouldn't normally be allowed to have, and you're able to equip it because, we see these, in the Dominion War, we see lots of cases where the Dominion will learn how to counteract Federation measures, or the Federation will learn about some new technology from the Dominion. And so that was something we wanted to, build in as like a thing that we could model. So we have a lot of things that try to sort of play in the space of like different resources you can build for yourself, or different things. But a lot of them either relate to the like between mission stuff. They might relate to like, shipyards or crew training facilities or things like that. So they're more on the bookkeeping side. Or there'll be things where they have some kind of physical component that they can tap into, so you don't have to remember like, oh yeah, I'm altering the value of this thing that's on a dial. We don't want to make you jump through too many hoops there.
Well, that goes to streamlining stuff from the 80s in terms of that gameplay, right? So,
well, one of the advantages of having to write out everything on a piece of paper is that it's all written on a piece of paper. I mean, there's a lot to be said for convenience, but there is also a lot to be said for, I think there's a lot of amazing game design stuff that persists in the indie scene, but just sort of like has fallen out of favor in the mainstream. That is really interesting. I don't know. Stone Saga has been an interesting experience on that, because we do a lot of writing on components in that game, because that was sort of part of the premise of that game. And it's kind of opened my eyes, because I went back and looked at a lot of older games, and I was like, oh, it's just very normal to just, like write on a component or give people a sheet to fill things out or whatever. I don't know. I feel like there's sort of an expectation these days that you get some kind of thing that's more complicated than a pencil and paper. And if that thing can be valuable and make the game better, awesome. But I feel like in some cases you also sometimes end up with like cruft that doesn't necessarily do it better than a pencil and a piece of paper, and that might have been more efficient. So it's a balancing act, but I think all of our craft is justified.
Okay. No, again, I'm getting more and more excited to see what you guys have coming out. We know the core set is around the corner. I don't know if you guys can give me any information on that right now. We're at the end of September. So my information says sometime in October, maybe, but I don't know if you guys can say anything one way or the other.
I believe when last we spoke to John, what he had said from the last show he was at was it should be in Q4 of this year at some point, but much tighter than that, I don't know the specifics.
Well, October falls into Q4, so we'll say we're in there, but Q4 works for me. So there's a good 3 months in there. So one of those three as of right now. Tomorrow it could change, folks. And
Yeah,
actually,
it could be
yeah,
different.
by the time this video releases, it might actually have already come. No, probably not. Well, if it does, that'd be cool.
Probably not.
Probably
That would be
not.
cool.
That would be nice, but probably not.
So there's two things you guys have actually touched on that I kind of want to go back to a little bit. So the first one, there was some mentions about titles for different starships. So like when you look at a game like Attack Wing, each title was okay. The Galaxy class does this, but the Enterprise has this special ability. Is that going to be a similar type of a feature here with Into the Unknown, or will it be a little bit maybe not as extreme of an example? Because usually when you think of Star Trek, the ship, the reason it's a great ship is because of the crew. So I mean, elaborate a little bit more on the title side.
So titles are a thing.
Mhm.
There are like, famed ships, for example, the Enterprise D. So there's a card for that. Um, and so, but like in a lot of other systems, uh, the Galaxy class is a chassis that has a lot of like capabilities that lend themselves to the things we know the Enterprise D did. And then there's a card that has a special ability that we feel reflects like, what was special about the Enterprise D. Uh,
Okay.
so like every ship class has at least one card like that at the start. One of the things you do with your, as you go through the campaign, is you can add those cards to your available inventory, and then you can attach that to a ship. So it's like, okay, well, I'm going to bring the Enterprise, and I'm gonna buy that special ability, and I'm going to always just allocate points so I have that in every mission. So, so like you could think about your roster as these are all the things I can do, all the tools I have, and what I choose to put on a ship can vary mission to mission. But now we always have access to, you know, these better shields.
Okay. All right. And then going along with a comment, Michael, that you had made about redemption and not having enough officers. I'm assuming part of the setup of the missions we're going to see, at least the story missions throughout the campaign, will revolve around here's your list, but you can't necessarily throw them all out onto ships at any given time. Is there going to be like a preordained limit to how many officers are available per mission, or is that kind of fluctuate?
So for story missions, it fluctuates based on the individual story mission, but broadly speaking, the magic number is 5 plus 1 line officer per ship. Um, Again, in a lot of the introductory missions, especially, we tend to keep it lower because we want to keep the game a little simpler as you're stepping up. Um, but yes, we sort of this was something we talked through a lot because we wanted action economy to be even between players, at least at the start of the game. Though, if you get all your officers captured, it's going to get pretty uneven pretty fast. And each ship gets a standby action. But on top of that, one of the things we talked through was like, well, there are going to be officers on every ship. And so every ship at the start of the game gets one standby, gets one line officer, which is sort of a generic officer per your faction. Um, and those line officers are the people you can replace with transfer officers by paying extra points. So your transfer pool is determined by the mission, or in a match play game, it's determined by a randomized pool that you bring, and you get some number. You get 2 of the 6 officers you brought are available, and then you get to decide after seeing the mission: do I want to pay for you know do I want to pay to bring Kern in, to hang out with Worf, or do I want to just stick with my, you know, my line officer? Um, And that way, your number of activations isn't changing, but the quality of those activations is changing a bit.
Yeah, so like
Okay.
your, that extra constellation ship could be commanded by a stock officer who's, a line officer, not famous, or I could pay to, put data aboard that ship and command it.
Okay. So what's neat about this, and again, you see this throughout the preview missions, is that your priority actions are based on the number of officers that you have, and then each ship gets its standby action. And one of the games I played kind of put me into an interesting situation where we had used all the officers on one ship, which was great. It made some awesome attacks. And then the next turn did not quite have the same level of action economy for later. So you could almost uh, and then there's ways to go over to, I think it's the cargo bay or engineering, and then get more of your officers ready, or maybe that was sick bay. I forget exactly, but it was on the left side of the SSD. That's what I remember.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
it's, it's the cargo bay.
is it the cargo bay?
It's
Okay.
it was in an earlier and much fiddlier version of the game. We actually had a set of station icons for all kinds of different stations. We had the mess hall, we had holodecks. That did not make it, unfortunately, but actually, fortunately. Um, I think in one point I put that prototype in front of you and I had like 40 icons for different stations or something like that. And you were like, that's too many. Put back some icons,
Well,
something
I,
like
I don't
that.
know. The way I remember that, I think that might have been one of my ideas that wisely got talked down. But the
Well, I just remember it had the best visual joke we made that didn't make it into the
yeah.
game, which was that on one of the Dominion ships, we had an interrogation chamber, and for the icon for that, I put four little lights.
But there were five lights, right? So, great episode of Next Gen.
But we thought a lot about action economy. I've That's definitely one thing that I've all the games I've worked on, all the minis games, action economy and turn order are just such a part of like the tempo of every game. And that was, we knew we wanted to make the game very much about managing these officers and that they're the thing that makes the crew go um, faster, but every ship can still do things without those officers. And that kind of, you know, that central conceit kind of defined a lot of things we wanted to do with the game.
So now we've talked about ships, we've talked about officers, we've talked about individual stories, which they really do play out like a Star Trek episode. So I'm assuming as you get into your campaign, and I know there's a handful of story missions within the core box. I'm assuming it's like telling a mini story, whether it's like a 3 or 4 episode story arc, or it's like here's what happens in this season, and the next expansion is going to be the next season of a story. Could you talk to me a little bit more about how the campaign stories kind of line up, starting with the core box and maybe talking about what we might see in some expansions?
Yeah, well, I think each box contains an arc.
Mhm.
We named them that deliberately. That's several interconnected missions. And when you get your next expansion, that adds the next arc, and that's more missions. And the way that they, all the missions within an arc, they're definitely interconnected. When you finish a mission, you do a mission report, and that's how you determine like the score and your resources, like that contributes to your resources as the campaign goes forward. Um, but you can also have events happen. Like you can achieve strategic goals, and those goals can they can determine like some of the resources you get. Uh, and you can also like a mission will have certain events happen that can also determine what happens in a future mission. So, for example, like, oh, you let this technology fall into the wrong hands. Well, In this other mission, that means you're both going to start out at a disadvantage.
Okay.
So that's one way that we're trying to tell a story where things that happen in a mission matter later. Another way is the things that happen in a mission, those events can also determine like which acquisitions you unlock to add to your roster.
And
And
Uh,
then go ahead.
Go ahead,
oh,
Max.
I was going to say one important thing to know about the structure of the campaign. So the arcs weave together, um, but not necessarily in a fixed order. You can play them in different orders, although the release order may have the most satisfying payout of previous events paying out in future arcs. But they don't have to be played in a fixed order. And each arc does not highlight the same factions necessarily as the previous one. So, the first arc, Into the Unknown, first arc of the Dominion War, is the Federation, the Dominion, obviously. The second arc actually focuses on the Federation and the Klingons. Now, the Dominion player, if you could have a Federation player, a Dominion player, and a Klingon player if you wanted, that's one way you could do it. But you could also, and there are rules for having the Klingon player join when when that second product comes out. But the other thing you can do is you can have that player, the Dominion player, if you have three players, can play incident missions against the Federation and the Klingon using the mission cards that are used for match play. So they can continue to play campaign missions, they're just not story missions. They can continue to accrue strategic acquisitions and various things of value, and they can keep getting games in. The other thing you can do is if you only have two people playing, or if you're really ambitious, you could probably even do this solo, although I'm not a big solo self v self gamer. I know some people do this and really like it. You can have two players, or I guess even one player if you're just one person playing all the factions. So you could say, okay, in this arc, I'm going to play the Federation, and Michael's going to play the Dominion. We're going to go on to the second arc, and in the second arc, Michael could say, I really want to play the Federation this time. I could say, okay, I'll play the Klingons. And we could swap factions. And then we could still have the Dominion play. We could swap back and forth with the Dominion against the other two factions to play some things. We could have the Dominion sit that arc out. There's a lot of flexibility in the design, because at the end of the day, each arc has a winner. The results of that arc will carry on narratively into the next arc, but it's not like the faction that was in there previously is going to snowball way ahead in terms of victory points or anything like that, because each arc is sort of handled discreetly.
Okay. So then there is this ongoing kind of campaign momentum, but not necessarily such an obstacle to overcome for the next player. But that's kind of neat. You actually, Max, answered the question I was thinking of asking was, going from one arc to the second one, will we have any kind of, transition there, or will stuff carry over? Sounds like the answer is yes. And, to kind of go back to my analogy where this is like, here's the main story happening over a season of Star Trek. It almost to me sounds like the match play with the individual incident missions are kind of like the one-off episodes that maybe don't really mean too much to the main story, but kind of feed into it. Is that a correct assumption?
Yeah.
Lots of nodding heads. So
Yeah, and that's how you can. So when you run out of story missions, you can add more missions to your story arc, to your campaign arc, by playing incident missions.
okay.
So your campaign can keep going on, even though you're waiting for that next expansion, that next dose of story to show up.
And again, back to the OP plans, one thing John is really excited about, which I think is awesome, and I'm very excited he is so interested in pursuing this, is having a lot of the event missions that you can go, play somewhere, have some kind of callbacks into, your campaign. So you bring, you play the mission, and then that maybe ticks a box that matters later for something. You won't miss out enormously if you didn't do it, or maybe it gives you a chance to check a box you might have missed before. But but it has some sort of payout in there that plays out in an interesting way.
One thing that John at Gen Con had mentioned to me is that if you get two players, so let's use this as an example. Max and Michael, you guys have been playing together, for a while. You've gotten through three arcs, and one of you meets me at a store. We're going to play a game, but I've only gotten through the first arc. That there's going to be some way to kind of match how we're performing against each other, so that you guys aren't so far ahead that I'm just going to lose. Could you talk about that at all?
Yeah, so there's some guidance on that in the in sort of bringing in a new player in the products, and that's something we've been thinking about just in general of like having ways to have those, if we want to play our rosters against each other rather than just playing our collections against each other, play our rosters against each other. We were just talking recently about how it could be kind of fun to do a mission mode based on either like war exercises like we see in Peak Performance or like a simulated thing. Maybe that's how we do Federation versus Federation, or sort of like a Kobayashi Maru, where you have this thing where maybe it doesn't give you like huge direct payout benefits. We don't want to just be able to grind your way to a huge advantage, but maybe there's some kind of thing where, especially if you're in like a weaker position, you can pick back up a little bit through these like training missions. So that's something we've been thinking about expanding upon. But there's some guidance on that already in the adding new players to your campaign stuff.
And there's a challenge bonus. So if I play you and you're a lot ahead of me, I'm going to get a benefit whether I win or lose. It'll just be a different lever.
Okay, that's kind of cool. It's almost like an ELO rating adjustment of sorts.
A
So,
little bit,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay.
yeah.
So now, kind of continuing this theme and the weirdness that's in my head. If you take a look at like the Alliance series for Star Trek Attack Wing, and you go through your different boxes, you're progressing through the Dominion War. So I'm gonna pose kind of a two-part question here for you guys. So the first is, as new arcs go, you said that it's kind of you can play arc to arc, and it's not going to be as big of a deal as future expansions come out. And I'm talking maybe a year or two or three or four, hopefully 10 years down the line.
Here's
Uh,
hoping.
yeah, I mean, if we can hit seven, eight, you're beyond any the length of a Star Trek series, right? So let's shoot for that. Um, but but let's say, will we see future like incarnations of the Dominion War moving through the whole Deep Space Nine Dominion War stories? That's the first question. And then the second half of that, as the war goes on, the battles do get bigger. So are we going to see more than just two or three ships on the table at some point?
The short answer is we definitely, you know, we've chosen to start things in the early part of the Dominion conflict deliberately so that as we go on, we can tell that story arc by arc and in a way that fits with the ships and the factions that we're choosing to introduce. We made a lot of our plans around kind of the narrative arc of the Dominion War for that reason. Um, I think the second half of your question was, I'm sorry, could you hit me with that again?
As you go through the Dominion War, you start
Yeah,
getting major fleet battles, like where you're breaking through
right.
the Cardassian line, kind of a thing. Is that something? Because this game is not necessarily combat oriented and focused, but the ability's there. So again, hence the question.
Yeah, so to speak to that one, that's something we've been thinking a lot about. And basically at the beginning, we're assuming people will have small collections. I'm sure some people will go out there and buy 5 Galaxy classes, and good on you for doing that. We appreciate it. But we assume most players will have a pretty small collection to start. But absolutely, as you play more of this game, you're going to have more ships. You're going to want to play with your toys, and we want to make sure we are facilitating that. So that's something we've definitely discussed a lot. One thing we've discussed is a concept just for even match play mode where you can just an escalation where you can basically take a current mission card and say, okay, we've got this mission that says we each get 3 ships. Do we want to play with, do we want to bump up one of those scout ships to a capital and have 2 capitals each Do we want to bump up, the number of ships so I have a full squadron of Jem'Hadar fighters? So that's something we've been thinking about, pretty concretely for just a simple thing as it goes on and as people have larger collections supporting those bigger engagements. The number of officers is not going to scale as as significantly as the number of ships, probably. You'll continue to get one line officer per ship, but you're probably going to be 5 plus one line officer per ship. So one of the nice things about that is, even in a bigger game, you're not necessarily taking way, way more actions. You're taking more actions, but not like radically more. And so, we feel pretty good about the game supporting those larger ship counts potentially. And, long term in the future, who knows what solutions we may come up with, but, we may find ourselves in a position someday where we want to, do something like Wings and X-Wing or something like that, where you can manage multiple ships together. But that's a 7 years out problem. We didn't get to that for what, 10 or 5 years for X-Wing, 6 years. So, we'll come back to you with exciting new ideas for how to handle a bunch of ships simply when we're closer to that, if we get there.
But we definitely want the game's support to grow to match the player base, their collections, as the game goes on. We're planning for for the collection you're going to have at the start of the game.
Okay. No, that's fair. That's
Maybe
fair.
not the collection you're going to have, but the collection we expect the average player to have.
I think it's fair to say I'm the exception to the rule. Then again, maybe not. I'm sure there's a lot of gamers exactly like me that have 2 or 3 of everything. Um, all right, so we've been talking about the campaign in general and everything else, and actually, fun fact, because we kind of touched on this a little bit. Um, yeah, that Jem'Hadar battle cruiser is great, but when I was at Gen Con, I picked up the Constellation and I took a look at the registry number, which was 2593. That is the USS Hathaway, which Max, you talked about peak performance. So my question here is that an intentional selection of that registry number, and is Stratagema in the game?
It was an intentional selection of that registry number.
Okay.
No, we do not have rules for stratagema in the game. That was left on the cutting room floor. But maybe someday.
Okay, one thing that I want to kind of jump off on this. In terms of specifically peak performance, we had crew that kind of came off, and they moved to the other ship. We touched base on things like redemption, but we really haven't talked a lot about, but we started to with To the Death, was away teams and how they can kind of work together. I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of those other little items that we see on the ship displays, like away teams, and like shuttlecraft. So can you guys talk a little bit about those?
Yeah. Uh, so teams was something that uh, was really important to us because that just feels very Star Trek. Is little teams of people beaming from place to place, accomplishing tasks, and your characters are part of that. So teams are um, they're a unit. They don't exist in space. They only exist on other units or on objectives, and they follow a lot of the same rules as other units. If you have an officer with a team, they can act in the priority phase. Teams also get to act during the standby phase. They're a much simpler type of unit. They're really analogous to the unit cards for torpedoes, which you've seen if you've played the preview kit. But they're a different type of unit. They're a token, and that's how you understand their location.
So will then that also be represented by like a card that you're going to wind up putting down on the field? And then you mentioned having an officer attached to it.
Yes.
Yep.
So you could theoretically, I'm just spitballing the idea here without knowing what I'm talking about. Like you beam an away team down to the planet. Here's your away team card. It's now here on this planet, and then maybe you have like a Will Riker there, or maybe not, and then it either gets like a standby action or maybe a priority action. Would that be a fair
Yep.
assessment of how that would
I'll
work?
take you one further. If you really want to, I believe you can put up to three officers in an away team.
There's not really a limit.
So you can put as many. So if you want to put, if you want to make if you want to put Chief O'Brien and Worf and Cisco in an away team, you can, send them down to have Chief O'Brien suffer on some planet. Um, uh, and accomplish all kinds of stuff with that away team and have it take three actions in the priority phase. I don't think this is good, and I don't generally advise it. There are circumstances where you might do it. It's pretty narrow.
Okay.
But yeah, you can load up an away team, and go, engage an enemy unit. And actually, putting officers in an away team has a couple of benefits. One idea we drew from Dust Warfare is we decided, officers should have a way to get damaged in the game. They have a health value like the away team does, and damage is assigned to the away team by default. But there's a rule called the needs of the many, where an officer can take damage for an away team that they're attached to. And so that allows, you can beef up your away team a little bit by putting some officers in it. And that's why, tougher officers having an extra point of health is really valuable and can really bolster those units.
And there's definitely ways I know when they're on the ship, they could get injured as well. Like council explodes in their face kind of
Yes,
a thing.
they can get air
Uh,
ramped.
yeah, or uh,
Yes.
Um, actually, that's another interesting question, kind of as almost an aside. I know we have like little damage decks per ship, and that's kind of per class. And it looks like it's just a handful of cards, at least in the preview kit. Is that going to be expanded upon in the core set per class, or no?
It's just a few cards per ship.
Okay.
We wanted to keep those decks, really thin and punchy.
Okay.
Most of your damage is tracked with your hull dial going down. You only get a damage card every few steps. You can also get one if your opponent rolls a lot of breakthrough successes and puts a critical hit on you. So it can happen at other times too. And speaking of game inspirations, actually, one game that I played a long time ago and then talked to Mike's ear off about when we were sort of thinking about this was a game called oh my gosh, why am I drawing a blank on the name? It's a little video game where you've got people running around your ship and your ship is always blowing up and things are always going wrong on your ship. What is this game called? I just had this in my head. It was
Oh, I know this, and now I'm trying to think of it.
I vaguely remember this conversation.
yeah, it was what was this game? It's anyway, someone in the comments will have the name of the game. But I played a little bit of this game, and then like when we were thinking about it, I was like, oh, that's what it should be. FTL. FTL. It was
Yeah,
FTL.
thank you. Yeah, yeah.
And it was like, oh yeah, like, oh no, my atmosphere's gone out and my like left engine is off and my ship is spinning. I didn't go back and replay it, so I actually have no idea how similar it is or not. I played this game a little bit years ago, but it left the vibes really left an impression.
That's actually a fun little app game. That's great to play a few planet systems here and there, and then move on. It's been a while since I've played it also, which is why I couldn't think of it, but I could see it in my mind's eye. Okay, so that's kind of cool. That was kind of the idea behind being able to move your guys around the damage cards and whatnot. I like the fact that there's a phase to move officers from one part of the ship to another. Again, giving you that dynamic part of getting your officers around. And I think the other thing that was kind of neat is when you're taking those priority actions, I almost feel like you kind of simulated the captain throwing someone off the helm to make the move himself, kind of a thought.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that
well,
was all what we had in mind. Was those kind of things.
yes. Well, we Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say regarding officers moving around, we knew that dramatically walking through hallways was a really important part of the Star Trek DNA, and we wanted that in the game.
Or
Well,
Data and Geordi hanging out in engineering.
or hang. Okay. Uh, I'm loving it. Within the confines of the campaign, we've got our away teams that are being beamed down into different locations. We have shuttlecraft though as well. That's effectively just another unit then that gets deployed for special missions.
Yes, you can launch. One thing I do want to say is this kind of ties into the campaign a little. So one of the things we do with the campaign is we step up the rules as you go through the campaign. So it's designed to also teach you and introduce these things because we know this is like there's a lot of things to this, and we know it'd be easy to get overwhelmed. So in that first mission, you're just learning how to control a bigger fleet. And then that second mission, you're learning how to work with away teams. Shuttles get introduced later, and essentially you launch a shuttle, you deploy it from the ship. There's a limit to how many you can have out. They're really like they're really more like a longboat that you can send a team out and dispatch it to go do a task. Um, they can fight a little. They're they're somewhere in a middle step between teams and torpedoes and ships.
Okay, so more than just a dummy fire weapon like a torpedo, which actually you have a lot more, if you have a good lock, a lot more ability to move those torpedoes around. And then away teams, it's like your separate card. So it's almost like a ship without all the capabilities of a starship, then is a way
They
to
don't
look.
have an alert dial, for instance. They have a simplified system for their shields. They do have shields, but they just have a set amount that regenerate essentially. Um, uh, they have a small simplified token that's just punch board. Um, but they're pretty robust in what they can do. They can fly around, they can warp, they can impulse, you can put teams on them, they can beam people places. They take advantage of a lot of the sort of technology the rules technology we had to invest in for ships. Yeah, shuttlecraft and other auxiliary vessels and neutral units and things like that all lean pretty heavily on that because if we're going to make people learn it anyway, we might as well really get as much out of it as we can.
Actually, it's funny you bring that up because one of the things that I actually wanted to ask you about, because it is fairly unique to Star Trek Into the Unknown, at least as far as I've seen, is the movement system. And how you're moving your ship around where warp is pretty straight, and then impulse has a different way of kind of maneuvering around with maneuver tools. So as this is radically different from both the flight path system and X-Wing and the maneuver tool in Armada, what kind of got you guys into making this form of movement?
Well, the most important thing is a Tom Paris quote, which is faster than light, no left or
Or left or
right.
right?
Um, and now, of course, in Voyager, they occasionally do their little micro jumps and stuff like that. But, you know, that can be a cool ability for Tom Paris down the road or something. But for now, or maybe for Harry, um, he deserves something nice. Because he
A
never gets it in
lieutenant
the
ship,
show.
maybe?
Yeah. I don't think we can do that for him, but
No.
maybe we can at least give him a cool ability. Um, but yeah, so we knew warp needed to be a really important part of this, and that's part of the reason we designed the game around systems, where the map is sort of this abstract representation of space where you have these systems where the action takes place, and then you have deep space in between them. And to cross between those gaps, you need to use warp. If you try to fly at impulse, you just kind of stop at the edge. You're still moving in the fiction of the game, but you're not going to get there anytime soon. Um, so that was sort of the first big consideration was like, okay, warp is a huge move potentially. A warp 9 move is an enormous jump. It'll get you most of the way across the board. Um, but but it's also costly and takes setup. You have to be at the right alert status and all that. And so we wanted to make sure that that was a big commitment. And a big strategic thing is it's like, okay, you need to be in the right system. And then, Mike, do you want to talk about sort of the impulse maneuver? I feel like that was very much sort of something we worked on together in a lot of
Yeah.
iterations.
Well, we thought hard about it because inertia doesn't seem to be as much a consideration in a lot of Star Trek fiction.
Mhm.
Uh, Although that is such a huge part of fleet games and naval games traditionally, we actually ended up making the decision after a lot of discussion that, well, reactionless drives and warp is going to be really important. And so we settled on a system where um, you move point to point and you don't have to worry about inertia. And as a result, we felt like turning was going to be important, and we knew we wanted to have like turning be an integrated thing with the bases. We thought a lot about the bases, about how we could make them delineate your arcs, also nest with the turning tool. Also, you could put your tokens on there. Um, and those things kind of came together. But honestly, I think I have to credit Max with the design for that tool, which I think is, that came up as a result of our, it kind of really just came naturally, I think, from sketching the bases out and how we wanted those to function. And then Max was like, well, here's a tool that does all these things and nests with the base.
Yeah, I did the not the ones that will go into your hands, of course, those were done by someone who actually knows what they're doing, but I did the original draft 3D models for everything with my extremely limited uh 3D skills. And then actually John printed out some of mine because he has a whole 3D printer set up and we were able to test them, which is great because I don't know anything about 3D prints really. Well, I know a lot conceptually about them, but I've never owned a 3D printer. Um, and so we were able to get that, and that was a really cool thing because obviously we had access to some of that at Fantasy Flight, but when the game, we didn't have access to that when X-Wing and Armada were in early development, I don't think. Certainly not for like Rotor. Oh, did we get some 3D prints of the original Armada tool, or did Christian have a different setup? Were there some 3D prints of that?
Those were early days of 3D printing
Okay.
for a
So
lot
that
of
was just
that.
like the cutting edge of that. But it was really cool that like, you know, we were able to turn this around with like two people's, I don't know, it kind of shows how far the technology has come and what interesting applications there are for that.
But with the tool, we knew we wanted you to be able to move, to make those turns, broad turns. That's definitely a thing that happens in Star Trek. Uh, we also knew we wanted you to just be able to turn on the spot because that's definitely like a function of how starships move. Um, and so we designed those alignment points so that you can move in a lot of different directions and represent a lot of different maneuvers. We actually have some in additional rules. There are rules for like lateral movement as well.
And reverse
Uh,
movement.
yes, because those are, because just the drive capabilities we see allow you to do a lot of different things. But the trick is managing your energy. And of course, you know, we also decided that we wanted that tool to double up as your torpedo launching mechanism.
That was neat the first time I got to launch the torpedo and literally just right in the front and then boop, there goes the torpedo. That was neat. And I'm like, that is a nifty little tool that you guys got there.
Well, and speaking of grognardy things, I remember one of our first conversations was about the game was like about torpedoes on board, and I didn't really get much of a chance to play Battlefleet Gothic, but Mike, you played some of that back in the day, right?
Well, it's I did, but a lot of how I felt about torpedoes was because I think they're just such a huge part of Star Trek, and like uh, avoiding them and anticipating them is it's important in a way that's different than some other cinematic sci-fi universes. And so I kind of always felt like I wanted them to have a presence on the board. And some of the earliest Star Trek games I remember playing, like even video games, um, torpedoes, torpedoes coming at you was such a thing.
And it's funny on that topic. I've recently been playing Star Trek Bridge Simulator with a couple of friends, and one of the things we discovered a couple of sessions into it is that if your engine power is high enough, you can actually dodge torpedoes. And I was really gratified to see that because I was like, "Oh, that's definitely a thing you can do in our game." And I didn't know you could do that in Bridge Simulator, but that's really cool. So.
Now I've got to go play Bridge Simulator. Thanks, Max. I appreciate that. Another thing I got to go do. So,
But those Borg missions are really hard.
more to look
there
for.
was an ancient Vectrex video game that I played as a kid that I think my babysitter had, and that had a Star Trek video game on it. And that definitely like you had it was a first person game, and the torpedoes would be coming at you, and you could actually shoot them down. And that was one of the first video games I ever played that was Star Trek themed.
It was a bunch of Klingon ships, if I recall correct, that you were shooting
Yes,
down,
yeah,
right? Yeah.
yeah,
It came out around the same time as the Star Wars arcade game came out.
probably.
Right around that same time, mid 80s, I would say, early 80s, give or take.
Yeah, yeah, it was just one of those things you bump into in your childhood and just kind of
Yeah,
leaves an impression.
I
And
remember that.
speaking of shooting torpedoes down, that is something you can do.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Um, Systems, because we talk about jumping across board and moving into him. So far in the two missions that we've been revealed, there's only they're kind of all size radius 13. Is there any missions where there's smaller systems, or is it pretty much all going to be that standard size as you jump around from story to story?
So for the foreseeable future in products, we're sticking with that one size because we need to change the arc of the edge indicators
Mhm.
if we wanted to do a different radius.
Oh, I
Um,
didn't think of that. Mhm.
but and because we did a lot of tinkering with system size. We tried smaller systems initially. We wanted to get more stuff onto the table. We found that it was tricky to feel like you had room to play in a system if they were much smaller than that. But we've talked a lot. I mean, in an early iteration, we had two sized systems, and we've definitely played. We went down to one because we just found one size was working really well, and the other was a little too small. But larger or smaller systems is definitely something we've thought a lot about, especially with regards to the possibility for larger map games. Putting down a game for a 5x3 or something is absolutely a thing we've thought a lot about. And having a bigger system, especially if we can have more ships, a bigger system is something we've discussed for that. So we don't have any like immediate plans to do that, but it is something we've talked about. I mean, we've also talked about how we do units that are too big to go into a system. Maybe they generate their own system bubble or something. But again, that's a problem for down the road.
Okay. Now, along those lines, because you're already talking about, maybe doing something on a larger scale, instead of a 3x3, maybe you go to 5 or 6x3. But in the story campaigns, your arcs, is there going to be like an overarching campaign map that goes along with that where, oh, I've won this mission, so I've now taken control of this planet? Something like that going to be seen? See you nodding your head, Michael. So,
Well, it's a natural question. That's not a part of the campaign at the outset. Um, we decided to focus on other aspects of like the story rather than the idea of how much territory you're conquering. Um, that said, that's always a thing that might be more appropriate in different products down the road. Like for example, a more strategic level, um, iteration of the game.
Well, and to that point exactly, one of the things we can do with the different arcs is we can introduce different stuff that are specific to the arcs if we want to. So, let's say we wanted to do, our first arc is sort of before even formal declaration of the Dominion War. It's the Dominion War arc, but we're very much in the prelude. But if we
Mhm.
want to get to like the back and forth in the Chintanka system, we could do an arc where it's focused on, planet hopping and you have territory you take over or whatever. So we have a lot of flexibility in our system to sort of add things case by case. But yeah, at present, it's more about the sort of flow of missions episode to episode, in the way that, they don't necessarily in the show drill down into that sort of strategic level stuff until a little later in the Dominion War as things start to crystallize a bit.
So, since we're talking about stories and the continuing on, this seems like a great way to get into kind of that last big question that everyone asks about. They've already said the first expansion is going to be Klingons and Federation, and I know that there's going to be some things you can talk about, some things you can't. But what could we look forward to in terms of a couple of the next series of expansions for the game?
Yeah, so I think they've been talking about this at conventions too. We're working on a couple different expansions right now. We're definitely planning on Klingons. We're definitely planning on Cardassians. We want to show like all the major powers of that period. And I can't give a lot of specifics, but it wouldn't be Star Trek without Romulans.
So then we'll see other things like cloaking will come out, although I'm assuming that'll come out with the Klingons.
Yeah.
Uh, and then we'll start seeing more officers that you can add into your rosters, different ships. And then, using Sway, okay, you now all of a sudden have a bird of prey that's along with your Federation task force. Uh, and then I'm assuming that as these expansion comes out, it's not just this is the ship, although there already is a repaint, I guess, of the Enterprise. They're calling it a ship pack as opposed to an exploration pack. So we'll probably see more of those with maybe different registries or color schemes or bird of prey wings up or down. Um, with these expansions, we're going to get new stories that I'm assuming are going to be tailored towards the ships that are in there. So clearly, a lot is going into each one of these expansions. So I would assume like we're not going to see a new one every month or two. It'll be a little bit longer in between them.
Yeah, I don't know what the exact schedule WizKids has planned out, but we're looking at probably 3 exploration packs in a year, maybe 4. It's not going to be one a month. And part of that is our own ability to get things done because they're pretty intensive. But part of it is also, we want to make sure that people can experience this game without it costing a total arm and a leg. I mean, it's not going to be an inexpensive game. It is ultimately, a high-end product, but we want to make sure that, if you don't get totally left in the dust if you're not, buying in every month. That's not really what the sort of the flow of the game is going to be like there. And as with the, we want the different levels of the game to be very, like reachable to people. So if you're like an Uber collector and you want to get everything, you've got the option of these ship packs. You've got an option for all the exploration packs. You're going to have plenty of stuff to keep you entertained. But if you're a little more casual, a little more kitchen table, maybe, you're probably not going to go to the OP as much, then, at the start, hopefully you get into it. But then you get an exploration pack when they come out, and you're going to still get a really rich, robust experience from that. So we want to make sure we're serving all levels here, when it comes to that.
Then will each new expansion, at least the exploration packs, also include like more of the incident cards that go into match play, so you get more of those one-offs?
Yep. Yeah,
Okay,
so you'll
cool.
have an expanding collection of incident missions. And then, when you go to one of the appeal of organized play things that John has talked about that I think is a great idea is, there will be preset scenarios for the event. So going to that will actually get you a, new event that you can play or a new scenario you can play. And it probably won't be like a new incident card you have to go to the event for. It'll probably be like a mission sheet of some kind. Um, and that may go on the up on the website as well after the fact. But maybe for a while, it's like you go to that, you get to the new mission, and then you can take that home and play it with people who didn't go. So there's some sort of engagement stuff like that too. And I don't know the exact details, but that's all stuff John has talked about of like wanting to, really give people an incentive to turn out to these narrative events and experience new stuff.
Well, we definitely have a whole plate full of like a buffet of different things that we can look forward here to everything coming out with Star Trek Into the Unknown. I know I've said this probably about 12 times already in the course of the last hour or so that I'm really excited to see what you guys have out. So I'm going to give you guys each an opportunity. Any final thoughts on the game or things that you were looking forward to seeing people get the opportunity to explore and experience?
I'm excited to see people get their hands on the full game, and see we the range of things that we've designed. We consciously decided to front load the game, so that it kind of touches on all the aspects of Star Trek that you would expect. Uh, but I'm definitely hoping that people will like find that digestible, and enjoy the campaign, and uh, that it hits the right notes. I'm hoping we hear that when people actually start playing like the full thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I'm just really excited to see how people play the game and what takes shape because we've done lots of play testing, we've played it a lot ourselves, but at the end of the day, the designers and even we have some really great play testers, but it's a fraction of the pool of people who will play the game. And for a very competitively oriented game, that can be very nerve-wracking. But for a game like this, where you can play competitively, we want to support that. But the thrust is very narrative. We're really we're excited to see the stories people tell. We're excited to see the interesting combinations people come up with. I'm really looking forward to seeing how people play the game and toy with the systems and all that. We've put so many tools in front of people that it's almost like there's an element to it that's almost like an immersive sim video game where it's like there's so many ways you could try to solve this problem, and there's so many different combinations of mission that can occur even within the core set, and then certainly as soon as you start to add in more of them it just gets multiplicatively bigger. um there are going to be people are going to get to tell stories we didn't even conceive of. And I think that's really cool. I hope they like that. But I think that's really cool, and I'm really excited to hear about it, and hopefully it goes over well.
Well, cool. I mean, I know you're going to hear some stuff from us here at IN Radio. For those of you listening to our conversation here, leave down what you guys are most interested in seeing here for Star Trek Into the Unknown in the comments below. I want to do, again, a very special thanks to Max Brooke and Michael Gernes for joining me for quite a while today. Thank you for your time. Really much appreciated. And I'm glad we had an opportunity to talk a little bit about Star Trek Into the Unknown. So, everyone, until next time, I'm Ken, and you've been watching Ion Radio.